I have a story to tell you. And it's a story that began a while ago. And it's a story that's still continuing. I entered into the story in about 2015, November-ish, when I was in Seoul, Korea, and I'd gone to the Slow Food Asia Pacific Festival to give a lecture during a short-term course for the University of Gastronomic Sciences. The course was for people who wanted to get to know the university's take on gastronomy and think about how that understanding of gastronomy could be made useful in their own context in Korea. And there were teachers, and there were researchers, and there were some students, and there were some food enthusiasts. And at the end of this course, we got taken out to a very lavish and extraordinary royal banquet with low tables piled with food and course after course brought out to us. And I sat myself down across from an interesting looking woman who I had not met yet, but I had seen around the conference. And we started chatting. And her name was Alva, and she was from a place called Dili. And I didn't really know where that was. And we just kept chatting, and she asked me what I was doing, and I told her about the course I was giving and how my role with the university was about being a professor in the world. And in fact, we'd named me for this year of my travels Professor at Large. I thought it was kind of a funny title. I was a little proud of it and a little embarrassed about it. And it was on my cards. And so when I handed Alva a copy of my business card at the end of the meal, she laughed and laughed and laughed and said, "Professor at Large!" That's the funniest thing I've ever seen. And it made me like her so much. And we had a very good meal. And a couple of days later, we were all sitting in the lobby of the hotel where we'd been put up. We were waiting for different buses to take us to the airport, different people leaving at different times. We all had our bags. We were exhausted and happy to have been there together and going off to the places we come from. And there was Alva, and she was sitting and chatting and smiling with a lot of different people from a lot of different countries and a lot of different food directions and food objectives. And she had this box full of chocolates, which she was clearly trying to get rid of. They were homemade chocolates brought with her from her home place that she wanted to share with anybody who wanted them. But she had lots of them, and she said, "I'm not taking these home. They came with me. I want to get rid of them." And they were delicious. Really good chocolate mixed with, I now don't remember what flavorings. But I felt somehow like I just ingested a piece of somewhere else, and that as I let the chocolate melt in my mouth and go down my throat, I was becoming different. I'd already felt that in Korea for those 10 days, eating lots of kimchi and lots of miso soup and lots of rice, and many other simple but intense different foods. I'd started to feel myself, sense myself differently. I felt like the mushrooms and the fermented vegetables and the radishes were now my friends, or more that their essence were part of me. And I was constantly, both occupied by them and comforted by them. And one of the things I started to realize was that my smell had changed. The smells that I produced, or that we produced, were different from the smells at home. And it was mostly on my skin and sometimes in my breath, but I could sense myself differently. I smelled different and I felt different. It was very comforting. And when I had that chocolate from somewhere called Dili, I felt, again, comforted and connected. So Alva asked me after giving me the chocolate, "Where are you off to next, large professor?" And I said, well, from here I go back to Montreal, and then in December to Mexico City, and in February to Singapore, and on and on and on. And she said, "Singapore? There are direct flights from Singapore to Dili. Come to Dili." And I was like, okay, that sounds great. And so over the next couple of months, Alva and I checked in, and she said, "Are you coming?" And I said, "Why not? That sounds interesting. It would be good to be in another place, and if I'm already on that side of the planet, why not take it a little while and discover something else and maybe share some more ideas and stories." And I hadn't actually paid much attention to what or where Dili was, so when I learned that it was Timor-Leste, or as I had known it growing up, East Timor, I was a bit shocked at how naively I had said yes, and how quickly and easily and unknowingly. And then I was a bit shocked when I found out that it was going to cost me $800 to fly on one of the 3 weekly flights from Singapore to Dili, Timor-Leste. And I laughed at my naivete, but we had already planned the events, and we already knew that it would work, and while I would only be there for 2.5 days, we thought it was worth it. So I went to Dili, Timor-Leste, in February of 2016, and we organized a one-night storytelling event, co-hosted by Slow Food Dili, and all about sharing stories of our food pasts wherever we had come from. Now, Alva was from Australia, but had a family heritage from other places. And her partner, Mark, her husband, was also from Australia, but had a family heritage from other places as well. Their friend Gobi, who had become part of our team for this project, was from Australia, but had a family heritage from many other places. I felt like I was not from any of these places, and as the professor at large, occupied a strange role of being both visitor and international, placeless. I felt like I was an observer and yet also some kind of catalyst. I was a professor at large and also completely naive to what the reality of Timor-Leste and its food was. And so, as I often try to do, I listened as much as possible. And I witnessed, and I reflected back to them what I was hearing and seeing and feeling. And I tried to incorporate those reflections into me so that I would be better at representing them later on. And so the storytelling night came to be after a car breakdown and an extraordinary lunch including avocado juice and chocolate syrup. Still one of the best flavor combinations I've ever had. And it came to pass, despite the incredible humidity and my fear of dengue fever and my overuse of DEET. And it came to pass on a recently swept platform on the second story of a cafe who had generously offered us their space. And because it was slow food, there was some education, there were some food displays, there were some questionings and answerings about where the local foods had come from and who had made them and why they were important. And then we sat down. And the people told their stories, and I observed and witnessed and reflected. And many of us cried, because many of the stories were about the war or the wars or the other violence that has happened in Timor. And many of us laughed because we were telling stories about our families and our aunts and uncles and parents and grandparents and cousins and nephews and nieces and children who were fun and funny and sweet and loved the food that we had made them or that they had made for us. And the night went on, and some of the stories were told in Portuguese, and some of the stories were told in Teton, and some of the stories were told in English. And I told a story about making Liptauer with my grandfather. It's a sort of Hungarian cream cheese, anchovy, paprika, onion spread. And I loved making it, and I loved eating it. And it was one of my strongest memories of cooking in my childhood, and certainly my strongest memory of cooking with my grandfather. And as I told the story, it was being translated simultaneously into Teton for those in the room who didn't understand my English. But even the translator didn't understand my English, because in Dili, cream cheese isn't a thing. And tinned anchovies in oil are not a thing. And a boy cooking with his grandfather in a suburban kitchen in Manchester, New Hampshire, the United States of America, was not really a thing. But my story was told and translated, and some people heard it, and some people understood it. And at the end of the evening, I laughed at myself because here I was, Professor at Large David Szanto, with a storytelling background who had come to Dili, Timor-Leste to tell a story. And it turned out that he didn't really know how to tell his story very well to those listeners. And some of them appreciated it. But in the universality of storytelling, in that experience of sharing oneself through one's words, I'm not sure really that I succeeded very well. And those around me who I was there ostensibly to coach and teach and give tips to, they told their stories as they would have done anything in their lives, naturally and with ease, with some discomfort maybe in being in front of a room of other people, but with great joy and with love. And so when I left Dili and went back to Singapore and then back to Montreal, I tried to imagine how I could tell this story in words, in a written way, that would do a better job than what I had done when I was there at that storytelling night. And that would honor the other stories I heard without retelling them and without trying to take ownership of them. And I'd been reading a lot of Bruno Latour and actor network theory over the past years. And it suddenly occurred to me that one way I could represent what had happened to me without necessarily owning the different parts of it or owning the people in those stories was to only describe what I had come into contact with, was to always describe it from my own perspective, was never to say what was, but only what I felt and what I sensed. And I ended up writing an article called Bumping Up Against Things in Dili, Timor-Leste. And I accounted for most of the things I bumped up against while I was there. That avocado juice, and the car breakdown repair shop, and the heat and the humidity, and of course Alva and Mark and Gobi, and the people I met and the foods I ate and the stories I heard, but always what I heard and what I ate and what I sensed and what I had come to know. And never about what was or what was documented or what had been told by others to others. I kept it about me as an actor, going through a network and tracing out a kind of pathway of a story by having been there and having witnessed it. And I think it's one of the better pieces of writing that I've ever done, because I stayed true to the idea of telling the story by telling what happened to one individual within it, and what that one individual bumped up against, both physically and emotionally, affectively, socially, and environmentally. And I think when we tell our stories, that to tell them in that way, with specifics but no generalizations about others, with generalizations about yourself, I think that tells a good story. And I think it helps other people reflect and understand themselves by witnessing that story and bringing it into themselves. So I have another story to tell you, and this one also involves Mark and Alva and Gobi and Timor-Leste. Because after I left, and things continued to happen in that story of all of them, it got pretty exciting, and it continues to be exciting. Because Alva and Mark founded a new cafe, restaurant, food studio called Agora in Dili, to continue doing what they were doing with me, but in a much broader way and in a much more dynamic way that was clearly going to have a pretty strong and lasting impact. Now I'm telling their story, and maybe I shouldn't, but some of the details are what I came to learn afterwards, and some of it's just useful to know as background for what I'm about to tell you. Mark and Alva created Agora with the idea of adding more value culturally to the food of Timor-Leste. And like many places in history, Timor has been beaten up by a great number of different countries trying to exploit it for various reasons. And it was colonized and invaded and occupied and battled over, both internally and externally. And the history of Timor in the last century is a history of incredible violence, incredible pain, and incredible loss. And one of those losses was the traditional heritage foods of Timor. Timor is an incredibly biodiverse place, massive amount of agricultural biodiversity, as well as cultural biodiversity, 45 different dialects, distinct dialects spoken in a population of 1 million people. It's a place that's hard to move around in because of infrastructure. And so foods often remain extremely localized and don't mix or crossbreed as much as they might if they were easier to travel. And so that's a great richness, this biodiversity. It's a great richness in terms of culture and cuisine. It's potentially an opportunity for economic richness. But it's also a place that, as it has been over history, is now a target of external powers that want to take value from Timor in terms of the money that is now starting to flow again. So many transnational companies, fast food, industrial food, and many NGOs are set up in Timor, pulling and pushing at the country's heritage, at its future, at its finances, and therefore definitely at its politics. And so Mark and Alva's project with Agora is to try to regenerate both pride and commercial potential in the local foods of Timor. That is, to make eating Timorese food exciting and prideful again. To think about what happened during the wars, both civil and international, and how that affected the foodways. To trace the paths from sorghum and millet to corn to rice and now to wheat as staple grains. and to find in the stories of the people there foods that can be known again, that can be appreciated, that can be loved, and that can be bought and sold. And so with this cafe, Alva and Mark are training a large number of young people in taste communications, and in storytelling, as well as preparing foods in the cafe that come from Timor and that come from Timor's history. And so, having created this cafe and creating this program of training and communications, they're now working on the commercialization part of local products. And so, in early 2018, I got an email from Mark and Alva who told me that they were applying to a program that was potentially going to give them some funding. And the funding was coming from a couple of different sources, including Australia and the United States. And it was about developing sustainable projects specifically within food. So they were applying for this and wondering if they could put my name in as a potential collaborator. And I, of course, said yes, why not? And so when they got their funding a few months later, Mark got back in touch and said, hey, large professor, do you want to come to Timor again? Except this time, not via Singapore. And I, of course, said yes. And so over time, we figured out what this project would be and what my involvement in it could be. And again, I would come back and act as a kind of coach and facilitator of storytelling, but also help them with some strategic planning and communications on the project. And also, apparently, do what I had done last time, which was to inspire them to think in some different directions than they were already going, and be there in my professorial way as a kind of intellectual coach to support their ideas, not just in a logistical way and not just in a practical way, but in a kind of theory and practice and making and doing way, in the ways that I apparently do. I was incredibly honored and thrilled. And they told me they would pay me and fly me there, and I almost said no, and then I thought, wait a minute, okay, I'll take money. But as we started to negotiate the contract, and as we agreed that I would be paid, I started feeling very uncomfortable. Who was I as a North American, middle-aged, white man to go halfway around the world to tell people how to tell stories? Hadn't I learned something the first time? Hadn't I learned that those stories were already probably being told better than I could ever possibly either do or help make happen? And why was I going to get paid? Just because I had a PhD and I had some history of doing this kind of work and I was called professor. Did that make sense? And I pushed back, and Mark said, no, we want you. We need you. What you have to offer will be valuable. And I really wanted to go back and see them again, and be back again in Dili, which was a place that had really transformed my sense of self. So I said, of course. Before I even got there, I started wondering if it was precisely my white, male, middle-aged professorial self that could be useful. The money for this project, and for many other projects that are taking place in Timor right now, is coming largely from NGOs working ostensibly for the benefit of the country and to help it be itself again. There's also money from many transnational organizations that's pouring into Timor, for all sorts of reasons. As we know, small places get exploited both for their resources and then also for eventually their labor and their potential spending power. And the money for the Timor-Leste Food Innovators Exchange Project was coming from the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and from USAID. And those are both large governmental bodies. And large governmental bodies are, well, political and articulated in very complex ways in terms of power and money and policy and objectives, both hidden and exposed. And this is not to say that the Innovation Exchange Program funded by Australia and the US was nefarious in any way, but it was connected to significant political players. And politics is never entirely obvious or clear in terms of its objectives. So I started wondering, maybe my normativity, my outsiderness, my representation of the powers that are conventionally ascribed to people like me, maybe there was great value in this, because in addition to what Ark and Alva were doing, there was some political heft that me just being me would bring. I didn't know, and I still don't know. But I often wonder how I might play myself in all sorts of different ways over the course of my places and careers that I spend time. When I left Dili the first time, on a plane going back to Singapore, I was with Gobi. He was also traveling somewhere, and his first stop was Singapore. And I pulled out some of the papers that I had brought with me on that 2.5-day trip to Dili. And one of them was an article on performance as research, radical interventions in anthropology, written by Dwight Conquergood. I hadn't read it before going on this trip, and as I pulled it out, the first line that I read was a quote from Michel de Certeau that Conquergood opens the article with. And it says something like, "What the map cuts up, the story cuts across." And quite literally, and even now, I got a shiver down my spine. That I had been carrying with me an article that says that stories undo the political divides that are created by maps. That the lines that are drawn that divide countries and divide people from other people and that divide histories, those lines fall apart when you tell a story that crosses them and twists around them and pulls them taut and then lets them snap loose again. Stories are what happen in the world. Maps are what we say happened. Stories keep things fluid and mobile and unstable. Maps define and make clear and control. And I was stunned that I had this article in my back pocket the whole time I was there for that first storytelling night, and I had never known it. So I shared it with Gobi, because I had to tell someone. But that line, "What the map cuts up, the story cuts across," became the major theme for my return trip to Dili. And I spent 10 days there that time, and we spent much time talking about the Timor-Leste Food Innovators Exchange project. And eventually, for one weekend, we traveled to the island of Atauro, which is off the coast of Dili and is part of the municipality of Dili, but is a very distinct part of Timor. It's home to 6,000 people, about half of them Catholic and half of them Protestant. The Protestants live on the north side of the island, and the Catholics on the south. The Catholics come from a heritage that is more Portuguese, and the Protestants come from a culture that is more Brazilian. But the food on Atauro is distinct even from that on the bigger island of Timor. And so it's an exclave in some ways. It's a small part. It's another isolated community. It's distinctive, and it's full of stories. And so again, on a raised platform that had been swept clean, this one outdoors and exposed to the sunlight and the birdsong, a smaller group of us gathered with food, and the storytellers this time were all from Atauro. And they all told stories in Teton, which was not translated for my ears. And those who were present mostly understood, and many things were written down, and much, much laughter was exchanged. But also some sadness still, and some tension, some anxiety. In Teton, which is influenced strongly by Portuguese, the expression storytelling is translated as conta história. But conta história means to tell history, to get facts right from what happened before. And conta história in the history of Timor is generally to tell about sadness and difficulty, because in the memory of those people who are alive now and telling stories, their recent history was not so comfortable. And so we had a challenge to overcome. How could we express that telling stories was an act of political power, was a way of undoing the lines that maps and histories and documentation have told about a place, and that telling stories was a way to take back power and to make the narrative your own, and make yourself the vector of that narrative, and bring forward incredible, beautiful stories about what the food has been for hundreds of years, not just in the last 50. And how food is a source of joy, not just nutrition. And how food is a source of comfort as well as discomfort. How could we make the act of telling those stories one that was not just an act of remembering sadness and potentially making that sadness be real again? The answer was we just did it. We talked about weaving. We told a few of our own stories. We shared food first. We shared coffee. We listened. I listened intently to stories in a language I did not understand. I sat there as a professor at large, being as small as I possibly could so that they could be as large as they possibly could. And I found that my role was just to witness. I was not a storyteller, I was a story listener. I was from away, and somehow yet I was from there as well. Because as I paid attention, as I didn't speak, as I tried to understand the stories through the gestures of hands and the wrinkles of brows and the smiles and the squinting of eyes and the occasional tear and the difficulty in the throat to express some of the words, I was helping that story be a story and not an account of a sad history. In addition to the Conquer Good reading and the idea of stories being political, I brought along this book, Research is Ceremony, Indigenous Research Methods by Sean Wilson. And Sean is a very interesting fellow. A Cree, First Nations person from Manitoba here in Canada, who has done a great deal of work in New South Wales, Australia. And his objective is to find ways that research about Indigenous subjects can be more Indigenous to a people and a place. And about how research can be not about me investigating the other, but about me investigating me. I brought this book partly as an antidote to my own anxiety about being an outsider, about being a very white North American doing research with Indigenous and local or more local people than myself. I brought the book along to remind myself to keep my outsiderness in check and to be a witness without imposing my own North American gaze. And I left the book with them because I wanted them to think about that as well, because although both Mark and Alva are very Timorese now, they are both from Australia, and they are both from other places before that. And so they are also outsiders as well as insiders. And many people from Timor-Leste have come, or their families have come, from other places. And even the people from Atauro, who seem as potentially local and insider as it might be, they've also migrated and traveled over time. And so they are also needing to pay attention to their own indigeneity and otherness. And so this book was sometimes read and sometimes just touched, sometimes just this kind of talisman of reflection. And I left the book with Mark and Alva, and I bought a new copy. And I felt like I had left with them maybe a taste of something like that first taste of chocolate that Alva had given me, and that in giving them my homemade chocolate written by Sean Wilson, I was somehow helping them to transform themselves in the same way that Alva had helped me transform myself. By their own choice, not as an act of domination from outside by an American professor, but as a friend and someone who had shared food and drinks and coffee and stories with them. I wanted us to be more each other through that exchange. Part of my agreement with Mark and Alva was that I would write an article about what had happened. And it would either be an academic article in order to, in some ways, valorize the experience and the project through the political articulations of publishing, or it would be a more consumer article, something written for a blog that could exist on their own website and maybe somewhere else. And we eventually agreed that the best effort that I could contribute would to be write something a little in between. A little bit Professor at Largy, a little bit Latourian, and maybe a little bit Dwight Conquergood. Ultimately, it was decided that it would be a blog post that would appear on the Innovation Exchange website, part of DFAT, and that it would be told in my style, but also with certain details that Mark and Alva would insert in order to best serve their needs. I was working for them, I was consulting to them, and I wanted this article to serve their needs as much as be a legitimate piece of writing that I could stand behind and stand up for. And so I wrote suddenly, very quickly, and all in a rush, another piece of personal perspective on what had happened. It was based on the idea of things happening quickly in Timor. Because things do happen quickly there, including fermentation, which is what that line originally came from. At the Agora Food Studio, they produce a great number of different dishes of what's called budu, which is pickle or fermented vegetables that are condiments that accompany the meal. And Alva is a great fan of fermented pickles, and as am I, we had a great set of connections over the budu. But budu ferments in about 3 days. Unlike colder places, less humid places, those lovely little microbes that produce delicious flavors in pickled vegetables activate and reproduce and do their magic extremely quickly. So I took this line that Alva had said once, things happen quickly in Timor. And I started to understand it as the way that Timor can be quickly transformative of not just food bodies, but human bodies. Certainly my time there, both times, transformed me in emotional and physical, intellectual and affective ways that I cannot begin to inventory. The article talked about change happening. Change not just at the fermentation level, but change at the level of agora, change at the level of NGOs and political action, and change at the level of food. And there are many words and details that Alva and Mark asked me to put in, and I put in most of them. But there are some things I really didn't want to say quite in their language that I wanted to say in my own language. And periodically we got a little stuck because they had an objective. They had a mission with this article just as much as I did. And we reached some very good compromises that I think we were all happy with. But it took work. It was not straightforward. It was a surprisingly political negotiation between just the three of us. And it was done with respect and care and trust. And the article is now something that I'm very pleased and proud of. Another piece of writing that I think does the best job that I could imagine for the context that I was trying to communicate. Stories, whether they're told out loud or written down, whether they're just imagined or posted on a blog somewhere, stories are political. Stories cut up maps. Stories empower their tellers. Stories can be dominating. Stories can be untrue. Stories are negotiated between the teller or the writer and those who are told about or written about. Stories describe a network. Stories express how actors bump up against things within themselves, within their societies, and within their environments. Stories are the things that create lines of continuity and pathways through the points of articulation of the three ecologies that Guattari might describe. Stories are not just fun, but they are also fun. Stories are not just joy, but they are also joy. Stories are about love and about care. And if we tell them without telling other people's stories that we don't have the right to take on as our own, we tell about ourselves just as we tell about the other. So as you continue to work and play and find leisure in gastronomy, and as you continue your studies or your professional lives, whose stories are you going to tell? And with what intention? And when you talk about those people and things and foods and feelings, when you tell your stories, what are you talking about? Are you talking about yourself? Are you talking about a society around you? Are you talking about the networks of distribution that your foods come and go to you within? Are you talking about something bigger? Are you talking about something much, much smaller? What stories are you telling? Whose stories are you telling? And why?